as we kind of spiral towards the U.S. Civil War, the actions of John Brown are worth their own video, because with John Brown, depending on what part of the country you're in and what your belief systems are, he's either a maniacal crazy person or he's a saint, a hero personified. Now, when we look at John Brown, we acknowledge that John Brown was a radical abolitionist, and he viewed bleeding Kansas in biblical terms. Now, this man is a Connecticut native, and he went west in 1856, bringing his large family with him to Kansas. He viewed himself as a liberator who would use his time in Kansas to avenge the sins of slavery. He took it upon himself to avenge the sack of Lawrence when he and some of his sons invaded a cabin along the Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 3 pro-slavery men outside the cabin, and the father was shot while 2 of his sons were hacked to death with broadswords. The Eastern press initially dismissed these murders, but when the reports were confirmed, the press kind of placed them in the greater context of bleeding Kansas. The sack of Lawrence, bleeding Sumner, and the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre took place within days of one another. So Brown and his family went back east to raise funds for another plan. Going under the name Isaac Smith, Brown had bought a farm in Maryland which would theoretically serve the purpose of supporting his large family. The purchase was actually financed by several wealthy white abolitionists, and it served as a stepping stone for his ultimate goal: a raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry in an effort to liberate Virginia's slaves. Now, Harriet Tubman was receptive to the plot, and the fact that Harriet Tubman made 1 to 2 trips into Virginia and Maryland every year to bring escaped slaves to freedom really convinced John Brown that an army of slaves would eagerly join his cause. Tubman offered detailed information on the geography of Western Virginia, and she agreed to recruit freed slaves from Canada for the cause, and she failed on the second endeavor. Now, Frederick Douglass was not so convinced. He visited John Brown on his farm, and when Brown told him of his plan, Douglass told him that he should really revisit his previous idea of simply creating a mountain enclave for runaway slaves. Now, disagreeing, the 2 men parted ways, and Brown continued with his mission. Now, Brown's execution of his plan was sloppy from the outset. This guy left a very lengthy paper trail at his Maryland farm, and his 18-man crew left for Harpers Ferry with only 1 day's rations. Now, Harpers Ferry was easy enough to secure and to gain weapons, but it wasn't near the main plantations in southern Virginia, which is where Nat Turner's rebellion began. Under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, Marines reclaimed the arsenal pretty quickly, and the governor of Virginia, Governor Wise, charged Brown with treason against the state of Virginia, even though he wasn't actually a resident. Brown was carried into court on a stretcher where he was allowed a 5-minute speech. He used his time to emphasize the contradictions between slavery and democratic Christianity. Now, Brown is tried, he's convicted, he's hanged. And this illustrates the growing divide between North and South like never before. Northerners denounced his actions while admiring his stoicism, and politicians of the new Republican Party, like Abe Lincoln in particular, will seek to distance themselves from Brown. The author, Ralph Waldo Emerson, predicted that John Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross, and his death was viewed as a martyrdom. For African Americans in the North, the concept that a white man and his sons would use actions rather than just words to advocate for emancipation and abolition, that was a novel idea. Southerners were irate when they heard about bells tolling in New England upon Brown's hanging, and they resented the perceived moral outrage against Southern slavery when it was a Northerner who had used brutal violence to try and abolish that system. Each side is really approaching a clear point of no return. And to kind of give one illustration of how this was depicted artistically, 1942. Horace Pippin was a Pennsylvania native who actually painted 3 separate drawings that depicted events surrounding John Brown's life. Now, in this image, Brown going to his hanging, the mostly white crowd has gathered to cheer it on, while a black woman scowls in the corner and refuses to participate. She's meant to represent the painter's grandmother, who supposedly attended the event, and her inclusion is meant to symbolize this personal connection to John Brown's legacy of liberation. So with John Brown, again, we're reaching this point of no return, the recourse with which war is the only solution.